Chapter 1. She was one of those women you seem to remember only at night. Fish had glimpsed her along North Meridian Street's Automobile Row where, he presumed, she was employed in some sales agency office. On his way to the U-Drive-It to pick up a rental, he caught shutter flashes of her through the traffic. Nice legs, he observed. Nice hips. Everything nice. Then again, in early September, when he had a wandering husband under surveillance, Fish ran into her at a bus stop. He noticed she carried a big purse with Jamie an embossed metal script on the flap. So now he had her name and the idea that her gentle mouth and her quiet gray eyes were strangers to laughter. All right, Jamie, he thought as he passed. There's so much laughter, most of it meaningless. Stay different, won't you? But out of sight, she was also out of mind. It was only at night in his apartment hotel room, he and the red mote of his cigarette alone in the dark, with thin dregs and a sliver of ice in his glass, that he would entertain notions of Jamie. And he fully intended to do something about her. Sometime. Maybe tomorrow. Some Tuesday, perhaps. A Tuesday then, and he awoke at 10 in the a.m. for no particular reason he could think of, propped himself on an elbow, and reached for a cigarette. He was no more shaky than usual, he chided. He was certainly no less shaky either. He had a head, but it was not the world's largest. A medium-size head, you might call it. By the time he had showered and shaved and rinsed night out of his mouth, Western Union got to him with a telegram. Decoded, it read, Great Lakes Indemnity authorizes $30,000 reward recovery. Charles Jules call. Blake. Colonel Blake, in one word, boss of North American inquiry agencies. Colonel Blake in 10 words or less if it killed him. Which it might very well do. Sending cryptograms to chaps with medium-size heads. Fish phoned down for breakfast and a newspaper. By the time he had finished dressing there was a to-do in the hall. The quiet protests from Sam, of room service, were being loudly overruled. Know the man? Why, him and I are like that. Old friend of the family. Fish opened the door. There was Sam, grinning. There also grinned a large and lop-eared individual, about 30, with curly, pinkish blonde hair. Good morning, Fish, good morning, he said. Nice to see you again. The old friend of the family heeled the door shut in Sam's face, crinkled light brown eyes at Fish. Why, it's I, Blake. And so it was. Blake Spear in a hand-painted tie and a teal blue suit with a gay bit of kerchief lolling out of the breast pocket, standing alongside the T-wagon on splayed feet shod in tan and white Oxfords. Blake Spear cheerfully helping himself to toast as he had, in the past, helped himself to other more valuable things belonging to other people. His name had first appeared on the Indianapolis police blotter when he'd blown the side out of a produce company office while trying to dynamite the safe. After reform school, he had developed a more subtle means to an identical end through a soft lead hammer and center punch. That had gone merrily on for a while until some forthright judge sent Blake to Michigan City to punch out auto license plates for the state of Indiana. Now, presumably, he was out on parole. Unless they were wearing ties hand-painted with palm trees at jail breaks this sea. Don't let me interrupt anything, Blake Spear said and retired to a lounge chair with a triangle of toast on his saucer-sized palm. Read your paper. Drink your coffee, you need it. Fish picked up the newspaper and sat down on the sofa. He reached for chilled orange juice. Blake was squatting on the edge of the chair, his knees far apart so that toast crumbs would fall elsewhere than on his elegant trousers. He licked a thumb. Fish regarded him with not much enthusiasm for a moment, then glanced down at the paper. The name of Adams jumped out at him from under the heading, Safe Burglar Slain, Companion Flees with $100,000 in jewels, so now he had it. A killing incidental to robbery. Mrs. Adams E. Adams of Cold Springs Road, returning from a party at 2 a.m., had surprised a man in front of the open wall safe in the library. She had rushed to the desk, had removed her husband's revolver from a drawer, and had emptied the gun into one Virgil. Red Bailey, recently released from Michigan City where he'd served a stretch for armed robbery. Dr. Adams E. Adams was in Chicago attending a convention of endocrinologists. All of the Adams servants had been out at the time except the chauffeur, whom police had eventually found trussed up with a tow rope in the garage. Blake Spear crossed to the T-wagon again. Don't let me rush you, he said out of buttered lips. But I'm here on business. I've got business, Fish said, his eyes on the paper. But have I? That's the question. Fish, this toast ain't bad. Blake heaped scrambled eggs on a wedge of toast and went back to the chair. I shot and then I fainted." Mrs. Adams was quoted beneath a photo that showed her holding the gun in both hands at arm's length, her lower lip in her teeth, her nose crinkled, and her eyes screwed nearly shut as though firearms scared hell out of her. There was an inset of Red Bailey, a heavy-faced man with a rock-like chin. He'd been living on South Illinois Street. He didn't seem to be survived by anyone, and possibly nobody cared about his being dead except Mrs. Adams. She'd have to redecorate. Bloodstains would probably clash with her color scheme. So you had the socialite wife of a prominent doctor, plus Bailey the heister, the latter discovered in front of a safe that had been opened by the punch method, not a technique often acquired by specialists in armed robbery. There must have been a third party, the companion fleas of the headlines. Companion fleas must have opened the safe, not Bailey. Yet Mrs. Adams had seen only Bailey. It made for confusion. Fish finished his orange juice and drew the coffee cup into the cage of his two thin-fingered hands. He sent a long and speculative look at the cheerful blonde face on the opposite side of the room. It munched toast. It licked thumbs. It was neither ornamental nor useful, unless you needed a safe punched open. And what the hell was it doing here beside munching and licking? The usual procedure for a private detective to follow on a jewel recovery job was first to channel reward rumors onto the grapevine and then wait for an underworld contact. But when the contact, dressed in a teal blue suit, munching toast and licking its thumbs, cropped up in one's own living room prior to the formality of the rumor, one might well ask what was this baggy-eyed old world coming to? "What sort of business, Blake?" Fish asked warily. "Ah." Blake gulped the last morsel and bounced across the room to hand out a card bearing the legend, "Quinlan Motor Sales George Spear Used Car Department." Down in the lower left-hand corner, Fish observed, "You have left a dandy buttery thumbprint." Blake shrugged massively. "The past, Fish. All over. A slate wiped clean, as the warden said. I'm here to sell you a car." "No you're not," Fish said. A scarcely used convertible formerly driven around town by a gentle old maid schoolteacher, clean as a ribbon, loaded with extras, and a new orchid paint job. "No," Fish repeated. "One don't look well in orchid." "Have you ever tried?" Fish pushed the newspaper onto the tea wagon and tapped the Adams item with a thin finger. He watched the other man out of dark eyes that were narrow between faintly puffy lids. Blake picked up the paper, absently helping himself to a crisp strip of bacon. He said and put down the paper. "That's all you've got to say, Uh-huh. Blake was all open-faced innocence. Fish pushed up one side of his mouth, distorting the slender black line of his mustache. "Could it be you have absorbed some of the strong moral fiber of all these gentle old-school marms who break in cars for you dealers?" Blake nodded and winked. "I absorbed them from teachers. Through my seat of learning." He moved to the door and went out. Fish rose from the sofa with the uneasy feeling of having been had. He crossed to the window, parted the curtains to look out across Pennsylvania Street. There, in the tarnished September sunlight, was the Orchid Roadster. And the girl in it, waiting for Blake Spear, was Jamie. Sweet little Jamie with her ripe wheat gold hair floating back from a face so sober and lovely that seeing it, even casually, you recalled in a flash of regret all of the others and all of your personal tarnish. Jamie and Blake Spear. Fish watched them drive off and fingered a cigarette. Muscles relaxed at the thin ends of his mouth. He thought, so she's something I made up. Drink cheap liquor and you'll have cheap illusions. Fish went downtown to police headquarters because you have to start somewhere. In one of the cubicles about the periphery of the detective's room he discovered Sergeant Mark Talbot, the gray old man of safe and loft, occupied with a small, taut, impeccably neat citizen with sleek gray temples and a lipless mouth. From the spring wound gestures of the latter, Fish gathered that Talbot was taking a bit of hell. Fish sauntered to the opposite side of the room to speak to a pair of plainclothes cops who were awaiting assignment. Presently Talbot followed his visitor from the cubicle, the sergeant's slovenly bulges emphasized by the precise edges of the smaller man. "Let me worry about this now, Doctor," Talbot advised as he showed the citizen the outer corridor. "I'll appreciate it if you will," the lipless man retorted. Talbot closed the door quietly and swore quietly under his breath, then started wearily back toward the cubicle. He noticed Fish. "Revoke your license?" Talbot asked as though he didn't even faintly suspect they had. Fish followed the fat sergeant into the tiny room, where Talbot hogged a puddle of air whipped up by an 8-inch fan. Fish used the ashtray and sat down. He made his eyes look very blank. "Why haven't you picked up Blake Spear for the Adams job?" Fish asked. "Alibi." Talbot nibbled the end of a fat cigar. "The doll, Huh? Yes, if you mean Miss Williams, Talbot said stiffly. Fish showed bright teeth in a kind of smile. He thought, you, too, old Mark? Aloud, he asked. A big handbag doesn't mean anything to you, then? Talbot scowled and pushed out his lips. You spend too much time in Chicago. Around here the preacher's wife can carry a big purse if she wants. Spear and Miss Williams went to a late movie last night. That good enough? Only if Miss Williams doesn't happen to be lying. Talbot shifted uneasily in his chair. I think she's a good kid. I think she might make a man out of that boy. He's got a job at the same place she works. I don't know whether his boss knows he's a con. That's why I had him drop in here instead of barging in there. And he brought his alibi with him? Fish's smile was quick and bright. Why not? Hell, if he readmit was a punch job he'd know what I wanted. Fish brought out a cigarette and wrapped it on the chair arm without taking his eyes off Talbot's sweat-streaked face. His smile remained and he let Talbot do the talking. One reason I'm not much inclined to tie this on Spear is that he called Johnson, that's his parole officer, and told him to try and stop Bailey from bothering him. Leaned over backwards, Spear did, to avoid anything that might look like consorting with criminals. Fish stood, lighting his cigarette, and his eyes were shiny with malice. You're in your dotage, Mark. I suppose we all have to crack sometime. Talbot rumpled his gray hair and flushed. I still like to give kids a break. Not Blake Spear, especially, but the girl. If she thinks she can take a boy to raise, let's give her a chance. Live and let live, huh? Sure, Fish agreed coolly. Just as long as I get my share of the living. He paused in the door. Was that Dr. Adams E. Adams who just left in a blizzard of horseradish? Talbot nodded, his eyes glum. Fish said. Well, thanks, and went out to use the public phone in the outer corridor. He called Gordo Nash, an ex-cop who held a private operative's license and was glad to take a job now and then to augment his slender retirement pay. Fish asked Gordo if he'd read about the Adams job in the paper. Gordo said he had. For companion fleas, Fish explained, I like Blake Spear employed at Quinlan Motors. Stay on him. Call in at 7, and I'll pick up wherever you are. Fish then went out into the heat and walked east to South Illinois Street. The former address of Red Bailey, the dead gunman, was a bar that had once had nightclub aspirations. The scheme of decor threaded tenuously from 2 coconuts on the brack bar to an artificial palm that rustled faded crepe paper fronds in. The blast of a 20-inch fan. The Coconut Club, but of course. There was a tiny dance floor and a stage where a chorus of anyway 4 gorgeous girls might have cavorted. The electric organ was neatly placarded for sale. Over these dried bones of live entertainment the inevitable robot of illuminated plastic beat its chest triumphantly in canned jungle rhythm. The one waitress wore bobby socks with high-heeled pumps. Of her, Fish thought, nothing more need be said. He liked the barkeep, a hunchback with the pitifully eager eyes of the very lonely. She of the bobby socks came to the bar and said, Shorty, an ale. She said something else which Fish didn't catch but which directed the hunchback's glance toward one of the booths on the opposite side of the room. The horsey said, we got. Shorty said into the beer cooler and winked at Fish. Ain't it a kick? Fish looked around and met a pair of eyes as black as his own. They were closely spaced in a small, almost delicate face. The mouth was cruel. The man's body seemed to belong to somebody else, too broad through the shoulders for the tiny head. He wore a blue shirt open at the throat, dank gray breeches, black shoes, and leather puttees which he slapped in time to the music with a rawhide quiet. Fish turned, again to the barkeep. Take away the whip, put a stiff vizard cap and a tie on the guy. What have you got? Shorty tried that. Somebody's chauffeur? Fish nodded. You're not so damned exclusive as you thought, are you? He watched Shorty reach for another glass to polish. Tell me about Bailey. The hunchback's busy little hands were suddenly still. He isn't here. One know where he is. But he lived here since when? Since last week. Shorty went and drying the glass burr carefully now, as though it were fine crystal. First one ever seen of him. H.C. came in and asked for George. George who? Fish asked, over his glass. Spear? Yeah, that's the name. But I'd never heard of the guy. I'm new here. Just bought the business. Shorty was still polishing the same glass. You should have seen Bailey start to wreck the juke. Geez, what a guy. Just 'cause it couldn't play Paper Doll. That old tune. Fish nodded, remembering. That's funny. Bailey outlived that recording by about 6 years. I told him it was dead, Shorty explained. Get it, he says, and then shoved me to the stairway back there and on up to my room. Geez, what a guy. Ran you out of your own room, huh? Yeah, stuck $50 in my hand for rent and says he was taking over. So I moved to the back room and Shorty's last word stuck out over loud for the jukebox had run out of nickels. Still there was music. A phonograph playing somewhere in the building. Upstairs, Fish thought. And Paper Doll was the tune. He glanced across the bar at the hunchback, and Shorty's smile was sickly. Fish drained his glass. He said. Red Bailey's ghost didn't lose any time, did it? Chapter 2. A dame, Shorty had said. Some crazy dame who'd given him $5 for a glimpse of Red Bailey's room. A sensation seeker. Or she was writing a book, looking for color. If color was what she wanted, she could have it, Fish thought. Green. Seasick green on the walls of the upstairs hall. There were crusted windows along one side, 3 doors in the other. There was a dangling light bulb and a radiator. There were other little things that scurried underfoot, and one wasn't quick enough and died with a dry crunch of sound. The front room, Shorty had said. A board in the uneven floor creaked under Fish's weight. From the dead man's room came the recorded voice of a whining tenor who vowed he would buy a paper doll that he could call his own. Fish turned the knob all the way over, pushed the door open a crack. She was there, about 5 feet from Fish, standing at the end of an oblong table, her back to the door. And never in its palmiest days had the Coconut Club seen the like. She was strictly north side from the slim heels of her $40 gray reptile pumps to the simple piece of gray felt molded to the back of her head. Her hair was unalloyed platinum, what he could see of it. Her soft gray suit clung where it ought to cling, and where it ought to have followed the long, lovely lines of her figure, it followed cunningly. Her gray purse was at the opposite end of the table beside a lamp with a paper shade. There was the pint-sized record player loaded with only the one disc. There was the telephone which the woman had evidently been using, for her white-gloved right hand came away from the handset as Fish pushed the door back and stepped to the side of the table between the lady and her purse. He took off his hat. Startle you? He asked politely. Behind harlequin glasses her large pale eyes widened and then dropped toward her purse. She bit her lower lip slightly, gave that up, looked at him out of a composed oval face that was golden-hued deepening to sepia in the hollows beneath her cheekbones. Her nose was the haughty sort, her mouth thin and mobile, the lips carefully rouged. Her eyes were on an exact level with his own, their pale irises delicately rimmed with ink blue. You're the police? She asked above the recorded crooning of muted trumpets. Private. He smiled, pleased with her face and not then much concerned with what went on behind it. Fish is the name. Sharp here. Which was not very original of her, provided she had anything to do with it. Cindy Sharp. Her voice was cello-timbered, and he thought her slight, contemptuous smile was not a personal thing, rather it had to do with her present situation. Fish turned off the record player. He then offered Cindy Sharp a cigarette. When she declined it, he lighted it for himself, watching her through the thin veil of smoke. He included the room in a gesture. Why? She shrugged. One is always reading about some person who's been murdered. She had noticed the sudden lift of Fish's black brows. Slain, then. Justifiable homicide, if you like. Anyway, it's never anybody one knows, and I've always wondered what they were like. These people things happen too. He picked up her purse, noticing as he did so that Cindy Sharp, who was probably not Cindy Sharp, had swayed toward him, her gloved hand tentatively extended. If you please. My purse. Her scent was something unobtrusive lavender, perhaps. Her smile was small and sure, and he didn't happen to like small sure smiles that afternoon. Putty he might be, but he did not care to find himself advertised on the face of an expert putty manufacturer. So he put his cigarette in his mouth and tipped his head to keep the writhing column of smoke out of his eyes and used both hands to open her purse. He said. Try me again sometime. I'm no snob, but our surroundings aren't up to the manner. She stepped back, affronted, and showed him a profile that was cameo cut. He looked down into her purse. Light blue and navy tissue choked the interior. It might have been gift wrapping she'd stuffed in there for lack of a wastebasket. Fish brought it out, and it expanded to attain definite and incredible shape. Panties. A pair of pale blue panties made entirely of tissue paper, including the navy trim and the koi pom-pom attached to one leg. Fish squinted through smoke at Cindy Sharp. Her aquamarine eyes returned his look without warmth. "Bailey's," she said. "Bailey's?" he echoed. "Listen, baby, I'm trying to accept a situation in which I have Cindy Sharp, who doesn't have to be Cindy Sharp but who is definitely fashionable North Side, in a roach-ridden flat above a bankrupt bistro playing Paper Doyle on a dead Heister's phonograph. That much I will try to buy because I have eyes in my head. But I am not prepared to swallow the one-time existence of a Heister who wore tissue paper undies." Her mask broke into laughter. "He didn't wear them, he collected them. There are 2 more pairs in the bureau. He must have been a fetishist." As though she could add to the razzle-dazzle by dragging in Freud. Fish shook his head. Red Bailey wasn't killed with paper wads while breaking into a paper doll house to steal some paper doll's panties, he told her. "You're the panty snatcher around here, and you're going to tell me how come if I have to keep at it all night." "I told you," she insisted. She had started to pick worry off the ends of her gloved fingers where it stuck like feathers to molasses. "It was simply curiosity." "It gets you trouble," he said, and then glanced toward the open door, for he had heard the creak of that informative board in the uneven floor of the hall. There was the pinhead, Shorty's member of the horsey set who, with some alterations, became somebody's chauffeur. Standing, his disproportion was even more pronounced than it had been in the booth of a taproom below. He was built like a tick, short and wide, with that tiny head. His black, close-set eyes had noticed the purse and the panties in Fish's hands. "I thought this was the men's room," he said with an insolent smile. He came in anyway and stood with his feet wide apart and flicked his leather puttees with the quirt. His eyes shifted to the woman. She seemed to gain inches of height under his glance and she stood very still. Fish said, "You two seem to have met." While they were eyeing each other, he stuffed the tissue paper pan ties into the side pocket of his coat. The man with the quirt said, "You'd better go, Mrs. Adams. I'm surprised at you." She hesitated an instant, then took a step toward Fish. "Arnie, make him give me my purse." Arnie didn't have to. If she was Mrs. Adams then she was not Cindy Sharp, though Fish still couldn't associate her with the news photo. He handed her the purse, and she turned swiftly and went through the door. She had a nice walk. Arnie kicked the door shut behind her. He smacked his putz with the quirt and spread his mouth thin. "You stay out of the Adams caper, or I'll skin you alive." "You're the boss, huh?" Fish crowded a step forward, his smile watery, his mind tight. If it had to come, it might as well come now. The quirt snarled in the air and slashed out at Fish's face. But Arnie had extended himself farther than prudent. Fish took part of the blow on his left shoulder, and as the lash coiled around the back of his neck, he caught Arnie's right wrist in both hands. Then it was a matter of turning and yanking and bending almost to the floor so that Arnie spilled over Fish's right hip. There were sounds to indicate that Arnie had found the floor without undue effort. Fish straightened quickly, dark face flushed. He started toward Arnie, who was now on his backside between the bed and the table, crabbing around, his right hand behind him. His delicate face was pale and cruel and spit flew from his lips as he spoke. "You shifty louse. Ever judo a slug?" Fish stopped. Arnie's right hand had reappeared holding a stubby automatic. "Small," Fish said of the gun. "Also noisy." "You don't care," Arnie panted. He stood. "With a slug in the brain you don't hear so good. I'm telling you to get out and stay out, and if I ever and you snooping around the Adams place I'll put one in you for a peeping Tom." Fish made sounds like laughter. "You don't think I'd make a good safe burglar? You look a hell of a lot more like a peeper to me and it gets you just as dead." Arnie extended his lower lip and spat on the floor. "Now get out and stay out." Fish picked up his hat from the table, turned his back to the gun, and went out. Minutes later he had crossed Kentucky Avenue to the Lincoln Hotel. The lobby was air-conditioned, and his heat-wilted body gratefully soaked up coolness. He took an elevator to the second floor, went down a corridor toward a blue neon sign that read, "Carl Davis, Artist Management." Carl Davis looked less like a booking agent than a professor of economics, being thin, scholarly, and concerned. He looked through shiny rimless glasses at the tissue panties Fish tossed onto the desk. "Can you associate those with the Toon paper doll and come up with any startling information?" Fish asked. Carl Davis appeared more scholarly and concerned than ever. "There was Patty Bryce, a stripper. She had a new twist. Where did she twist it? Fish wanted to know. He sat down in a chair and stretched lean legs in front of him. She was slightly terrific at a joint called the Coconut Club for a week 5, maybe 6 years ago. She was booked as the paper doll, see? Stiff paper dresses, Carl Davis explained. Silhouettes they were, actually, with shoulder tabs. She'd work down to these, indicating the panties. Then toss them to the nearest male patron as she skipped into the wings. He shook his head. Slightly terrific. The cops closed the joint. Then what happened to her? Fish persisted. Chicago. They're more broad-minded there. But I heard she was dead. Pneumonia probably, Fish quipped. Paper moths got into her wardrobe. Carl Davis made a wry face. My union forbids I should laugh at non-professionals, Fish laughed. Somebody had to. Have you some glossies of Patty Bryce? Carl Davis shook his head. I didn't book her. She was on her own, self-promoting, a B-girl with an idea. Personally, I've never seen the lady. I just heard how her act ran. Fish stood. Well, thanks for a nice try. Not at all. Any time, John. Carl Davis waved the paper panties. Take these with you. My wife mightn't understand. M. Morgan went down into the cool lobby again, sought out the battery of telephones, and placed a long-distance call to North American Inquiry in Chicago. When he had the home office switchboard, he asked for McGowan, a woman, some small wheel in the inner office setup. He always asked for McGowan. Once, at 3 a.m, he had called the home office and talked to McGowan. She was something like God, he thought, for while he had never seen her she always seemed to be there when she was needed. Now she was on the wire again, her voice crisp and efficient. He said, I'd like publicity prints of a stripper named Patty Bryce who was booked as the paper doll. She's thought to have invaded Chicago from here 5 or 6 years ago, and I've heard she's dead. Just a minute, said the unruffled voice of McGowan. She must have been writing. He wondered what she was like and just what she had been doing in the office at 3 a.m. that time. He smiled to himself. Maybe he'd been wrong about McGowan. The devil, too, kept odd hours. Yes, Mr. Fish? She prompted. Just 1 or 2 pictures. Can do? I'll give it my best. McGowan, I love you, he said. God or devil? Why, Mr. Fish, you must be drunk. Yet she had sounded less shocked than relieved. Maybe McGowan, too, had wondered. Fish's rented sedan flaunted white plumes of dust along Dr. Adams E. Adams' crushed stone drive. The place was a miniature plantation behind a quarter-mile of box-trimmed hedge. Light crocheted doilies stiffened with sugar, circular settees of white-painted wrought iron surrounded the trunks of big elms in a billiard-cloth lawn. But the elms were dead and in dying had left the house stark and inhospitable in the glare. Dr. Adams was not at home. The butler, a faint beery odor about him suggested he had been pleasantly engaged with a cold bottle somewhere, took Fish's card to Mrs. Adams and returned presently to announce that the lady was at home. Fish was led through a spacious living room where not much imagination was needed to tie forbidding ribbons arm to arm on the valuable period chairs. Mrs. Adams was in the basement, it seemed. Doing the laundry, no doubt, Fish suggested. But the quip was lost on the butler, whose beer was getting warm and flat. He opened a door at the foot of the basement stairs and then withdrew. In the social room beyond, a woman in black satin lounging pajamas lay inverted on a red leather chaise, her hips, shoulders and dark head on the seat, her legs extended up across the tilted backrest with her small sandaled feet considerably higher than her head. One hand cuddled a chimney glass half full of sloe gin, while the other held Fish's card up against the indirectly illuminated ceiling. My God, she said. Not another policeman. It was time to his entrance. She rolled her head to the left and looked at him, and she was not Mrs. Adams. Or else she was, and there were 2 of them. She brought her feet down from the ceiling, turned, sat up with her legs coiled under her. She did all this without scramble. She was supple, all quickness of a mercurial sort. Her hair, black and lustreless as soot, was artfully arranged to suggest it hadn't been arranged at all. It tangled sweetly above a heart-shaped face defined by a pointed chin and high-arched brows that lent her green eyes an expression of perpetual surprise. Or, it was an expression of having been surprised. So often before you came along that nothing you would ever do could possibly surprise her. You had a choice and the ripe red mouth tempted you to accept the latter. He came toward her, his smile wary. She stood angrily, taller than he had anticipated but not as tall as another Mrs. Adams who called herself Cindy Sharp. His eyes went wandering along the embroidered row of melting Dali watches that ran diagonally across her blouse and dripped gold on otherwise unrelieved black satin. Not, he thought, that any relief was necessary. A figure such as hers would contribute less than nothing toward monotony. Apparently frank admiration was the correct approach. When he got back to her face, he found her eyes had softened. "I'm sorry I was rude," she apologized to him. "I didn't notice." You didn't notice what?" With a warm laugh, she reseated herself on the red leather chaise. "I don't think I noticed anything I wasn't supposed to notice," Fish said. "Quick." She nodded her moppet's head. "For a policeman." She glanced down at his card again and then examined him curiously. "Did the deadly double hire you?" He was not as quick this time. Charlie, she said impatiently. "The country doctor. John Hopkins' gift to sluggish thyroids." "I'm in this for the insurance company," Fish explained. "Your jewels were insured, as you no doubt know." She grew round-eyed over not knowing. "Nobody told me. How was I to know?" "Your husband probably took out the policy." "But he might have told me," she said pettishly. "I'd just like to know what goes on around here once in a while." She turned, her mouth sullen, and swayed to a red and chrome bar against a wall of pickled pine. She seemed to be a little drunk, but for a woman who had killed a man not 15 hours before, she was doing fine. Chapter 3. Fish thought that this was more like it. Pleasant surroundings, and Mrs. Adams might develop into congenial people. One of the troubles with crime, he had discovered, was its prevalence among criminals. When she put his brimming glass of bourbon over ice on the bar, the glass lighted up with neon inside its hollow wall. "That's quite a gadget." It was quite a goiter, Mrs. Adams said, and included the entire bar in a somewhat tipsy gesture. "We have this to fondly remember Mrs. Van Wyck's operation." They drank and she refilled his glass and he said, "Whoa. That's damned near an office call you've got in there," she laughed. "I've got damned near a consultation fee in me already. You want to catch up, don't you?" It seemed a fine idea. "But it gets you trouble," he said. "I've got trouble." She propped elbows on the bar, looking gloomy. "I'd like to know why in the great burning hell I had to go and put all 5 slugs in that big red Irishman." "Well, it's like this," he tried to explain. "When a man kills a snake he drops a rock on its head. But a woman gets a hoe and chops the snake into little bits of pieces." She didn't get it at all. "I didn't use a hoe," she said. Shuddering slightly, she picked up her glass and went back to the chaise. He found her easy to follow. She had saved a portion of the chaise for him, as though the room were crowded, and this she patted cozily. He sat down beside her, rested forearms on thin knees, and studied Mrs. Adams' profile. It still didn't look like the newspaper photo, but then she had been making a face. He asked finally, "What was Bailey doing while you were getting the gun out of the desk?" "Looking inside the safe." She stared fixedly at the floor. "Then he turned and lunged at me and I shot and I shot." "Then you fainted." "You were all alone?" "Except for Arnie." She uttered a scornful laugh. "Arnie was all tied up in the garage. Somebody bopped Arnie, but isn't it funny, he didn't have a lump to show for it." Fish sipped from his glass. "Did the safe burglar leave any of his tools behind?" She nodded. "Wasn't that sweet of him?" "Our tools." "Stuff from the garage." "How's that again?" he asked, eyes clouded with doubt. "A hammer and stuff he got from our garage. That's when he bopped Arnie." If he was bopped. It was the first time Fish had ever encountered a boxman who left his tools at home. "Must be a plumber," he said whimsically. He put his glass down on a nearby table. Mrs. Adams asked if he'd have another refill, and he said, "Thanks, no. It gets you trouble." "Gets you fun first," she said archly. He said, "Let's focus while I still know my name and occupation. Describe the stolen jewels." "Emeralds. My second-hand emeralds." "Why second-hand?" "They were Cindy Sharp's, Adam's first wife. He's such a stinker she wouldn't take anything from him, not even his name." The second Mrs. Adams patted away a yawn and stood, quick and liquid. Fish watched her go to the bar for a short one. She then came hack to stand at the end of the chaise, her lips apart and moist from her drink. She knelt with one knee on the chaise, looked at him through half-closed eyes. "Fish, I'm scared." Of what? He made room for her. Plenty of room, thinking a smart man would get up and leave, but who wants to be that smart? Of what, you say? Of what? Don't know. She leaned toward him, her mouth sulky, green eyes up to no good whatever, gave him a little push that sent his shoulders against the backrest, and then smoothly nestled into his arms. He tried to kiss her, but she turned her head. Her soot-black hair was harsh against his mouth. Harsh and dead. No, Fish, just hold me like I was a little girl who bumped her head or something. That, he said, draws pretty heavily upon the imagination. It struck her funny. She pushed up from him, laughing. He made his second try good, and her kiss was warm and searching and distinctly favored with slow berries. She sat up suddenly, her head tipped, listening. Was that a car in the drive? He considered her pleasantly through half-closed eyes and shaped his numb lips into a smile. I wouldn't know. I have an absolutely one-track mind. Upstairs, a door closed. Neat footsteps tracked across the ceiling. Copyright F the social room. She twisted to face him, her eyes shiny with alarm. Damn it, get that stuff off your mouth, quick. Here, let me. She was over him instantly, and she jerked out something that had worked its way to the top of Fish's coat pocket. Something she might have supposed to be a handkerchief but which blossomed into blue tissue paper panties. She stood slowly, her puzzled stare on the crazy thing in her hand. You and your one-track mind, Charlotte said under her breath. She dropped the panties into his lap and flew to the door. Neat footsteps were registered and the basement stairs. Fish scrubbed at his mouth with his handkerchief, wadded that and the panties out of sight, came to his feet as the door opened. Charlotte Adams was between him and the small man with the sleek gray temples and lipless mouth, a man all edges and taut drawn wire, but for all her quickness she wasn't quick enough to put much wool over those colorless eyes. Fish was first aware of suspicion and then pain on the doctor's face. Then nothing, it was just a face, a tight cork in a bottle of seething emotion. Charlotte was really pouring it on. Her double darling, she called the doctor. You're late, double darling. Late? It was a dry snap of sound. Dr. Adams kissed his wife absently and then put her aside like a piece of bric-a-brac won at a carnival. His eyes sought Fish's and clashed with them. I don't believe I know you, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. Charlotte was prettily dismayed. It's Mr. Fish, darling. He's a private detective, and it's about the robbery. The double Adams made it apparent he did not intend to shake hands. I am not aware that I hired a private investigator, he said in his neat, dry manner. You entered a claim on a Great Lakes indemnity policy, Fish explained, not smiling. Automatically, it's my baby. Charlotte looked from one to the other like a gamin expecting a street brawl. The doctor touched a button beneath the switch plate at the side of the door. He drew in his mouth, pulled down neat gray brows, and continued his study of Fish. I see. Then if it is automatic, as you say, and therefore unavoidable, may I suggest you conduct your investigation elsewhere? It should be fairly apparent the jewels are not around here, otherwise I should not have filed the claim. Fish nodded agreeably. But I do need a complete description of the missing articles for the records. That you may acquire from the police, said Dr. Adams as the butler appeared in the door. Good afternoon. Instead of immediately returning to his car after he had been brushed off the veranda, Fish sauntered around the side of the house and toward the GARAGE, a three-car, white-painted building with a half-story above for the chauffeur's quarters. He sidled between the doctor's business coupe and a black town sedan to reach the stairway that led to the floor above. He could hear water running through a pipe and somebody whistling the battle hymn of the Republic. The door at the head of the stairs was unlocked, and Fish entered a large, very warm room with 4 dormer windows, pleasantly furnished for both living and sleeping. The somebody was taking a shower beyond a white enameled door at the north end. There were dark gray breeches, a blue shirt, underwear and socks piled on a chair, and black leather shoes and puttees were heaped on the floor beneath. An old radio gave forth with a soap opera on an end table beside a comfortable lounge chair. Fish went to the chair where the clothes were piled. Arnie's gun was a recognizable lump in the breeches pocket. He pushed all the clothing to the floor, sat down, and lighted a cigarette. The water continued to splash in the bath, Arnie kept whistling, and the bickering couple on the radio were working into a dramatic interlude that would doubtless culminate in a commercial. The woman sounded a lot like Charlotte Adams, which shows what a kiss can do in the way of stimulating the imagination. Fish listened. But darling, I never saw the man before. Well, you didn't have to receive him in that, That indecent costume. She, a purring laugh, who gave me this indecent costume and said the silly melted watches reminded him of how much time he'd wasted. Fish got up, jolting ashes from his cigarette, and went to the radio. He turned the station selector, but Charlotte Adams' voice came through anyway. So maybe I am a little drunk, Charlie. You don't know what I've gone through. You don't now what it's like to kill and TM, and even if it is some old burglar. Charlie remained silent. She, coaxingly. You're staying home tonight? He. I'm going back to hospital right now. Well, the hell with you. There was no commercial. A smile tugged at the corner of Fish's mouth as he returned to the chair and sat down. The shower had stopped running. The whistler had become a singer, still to the tune of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Oh, she stepped into the water and it came up to her knees. Oh, she stepped into the well, I'll be damned, look who's here. Fish looked over his right shoulder at the pinhead man in the bathroom door. Arnie was wearing an old pair of scuffs and a white terrycloth robe that exposed kinky black hair on his broad, flat chest. Hi, Fish said cheerfully, the bourbon still with him. You missed an exciting episode of Charlie's Other Wife. Arnie stared without comprehension for a moment, then took gliding steps to the radio and turned it off. He picked up a cigarette which he didn't light and stared at Fish as though wondering what ought to be done with him. Can't Dr. Adams turn off that mic in the house? Fish asked. Arnie nodded. He must have forgot. Your car gave him the ants. Papa's little tattletale, Fish said and smiled widely. That's what you are, Arnie. The chauffeur's delicate yet cruel face remained puzzled. Did you know the first Mrs. Adams was in Red Bailey's room before you joined us? No. Arnie sat down slowly on the arm of the chair. What did you expect to find? I pick up what I can where I can, Arnie admitted frankly. He lighted his cigarette. His cheeks hollowed and his black eyes squinted. Like what would you pay me I don't tell Doc what you and little Charlotte was up to? Fish appeared surprised. Then. Well, that's only business, with the sweet setup you've got here. What does the other guy pay? Arnie broke off and stood angrily. What other guy? Fish dropped his cigarette into an ashtray, tipped back in the chair, and regarded the chauffeur with thinly veiled amusement. You're blackmailing Charlotte, aren't you? But she's not too well heeled. You think there's something not kosher about the robbery kidding last night, and you're trying to latch onto something that'll let you get your hooks into the doctor, who seems to have plenty of lettuce. You're not only built like a tick, you've got some of a tick's parasitic attributes. Arnie muttered a curse, turned, went to the chest of drawers, and began to lay out clean linen. You know what I said I'd do if I caught you snooping around here? Fish stiffened slightly in the chair as Arnie swung around with a Colt .45 in his fist. The chauffeur grinned around his cigarette and glided his scuffs across the room. He didn't seem too sure of his marksmanship. I got two of them. A mama size and a papa size. This is Papa. He shoved the Colt into Fish's face. Papa don't allow no peeping round this house. A dry scuff of sound came in through an open window. Footsteps on the crushed stone drive. Arnie said. And don't think Doc won't back me up. I worked for him 12 years and what I say goes around here. Arnie had a sobering point there. The doctor's footsteps were plainly audible in the garage below. Fish slid down a little in the chair and tried not to look as though he intended to kick Arnie's right kneecap off. Arnie, telepathic, stepped back so hurriedly that he left one dirty white scuff on the floor like a footprint. He laughed uneasily and flicked a glance toward the door at the head of the steps. Caught a snooper, Doc. Dr. Adams walked stiffly into the room and approached Fish's chair. The emotionless face of the doctor wore a grayish pallor. Wrinkles like hair cracks in plaster crossed his plus mouth. All of the steel springs within him were wound tight. I think, Arnie, the doctor said, your choice of weapons rather flatters the man. And he hit Fish in the side of the face with a small fist, rocking the thin man in the chair, and then stepped back as though startled by his own temerity. Fish stood tall and lath-like, the color spreading across his face, his long hands open at his sides. The doctor pointed to the door with a quivering finger, and whatever neat little speech he had prepared was choked up within him by his fury. Fish nodded. I can take a hint. Just one word of advice, watch Arnie. He's trying to put the hooks in you. Fish moved without haste through the door, down the steps, and out of the garage. His sun was lowering, copperish through the haze, and the big white house was clutched in gnarled fingers of shadow cast by the dead elms. Fish regained his car, drove into the street and north to turn around at the next driveway and park within a few hundred feet of the Adams gate. He waited, his tongue exploring the cut inside his cheek. Perhaps 5 minutes passed before the doctor's gray coupe came barreling out of the crushed stone drive to make a screaming turn to the south. Fish tramped his accelerator and chased the coupe as far as 30th Street, the crosstown artery. At this point he was close enough to recognize the driver as Arnie, not the double Adams. It was about what he had expected. A jealous husband behaving according to pattern. It was 4:30 p.m. when Fish entered his rooms at the apartment hotel. He went down to the phone and made an effort to trace down Red Bailey's antecedents through the editorial offices of the local papers. It was not until he got around to the Times that he found a sob sister who was working on a supplement feature on local habitual criminals and how they got that way. Red Bailey had been left an orphan at an early age, his father a southern Indiana coal miner, his mother one Mary Agnes Sullivan born in Ireland. Fish expressed, "Thanks," hung up, went into the bedroom where he stripped to his shorts and stretched himself out on the bed. He slept soundly until Gordo Nash telephoned. Chapter 4. Dusk deepened along 34th Street as Jane Williams opened a card table in the bay window of her second-story flat in the red brick building next to the drugstore on the corner. She then spread a gay print cloth and set out table service for two. Fish watched her from the opposite side of the street where he'd parked his rental car in front of a convenient tavern. He watched her because it gave him pleasure and because he couldn't possibly watch Blake Spear. Blake lived in a room over the drugstore, and if he came down to the street, he would have to emerge at the door next to the last show window of this side of the drugstore building. Gordo Nash had said on the phone, "You want to pick it up here?" Subject came home about an hour ago with a blonde doll who works at Quinlan Motors. So Fish had met Gordo Nash at the tavern. It had been an uneventful day for the latter. Subject had done nothing even faintly suspicious, unless selling a beat-up roadster with an orchid paint job could be so construed. Later, the subject had made a quick trip to Dr. Adams' office downtown. As soon as Blake had entered the consultation room, Gordo Nash had approached the office nurse to learn from her that Blake was a regular patient of the doctor's. "He's regular, maybe," Fish had said to Gordo, "but I'm not too sure about the patient part of it. Think you can find out what ails Blake, if anything?" Which was a large order, doctors being close-mouthed as they are, but Gordo promised to have a go at it first thing in the morning. Fish lighted a cigarette from a glowing butt and watched Jamie place a bouquet of blue flowers in the center of the table. In a sheer floral print dress and a frilly white apron, she was something to look at. Some article on the table required straightening. Jamie straightened it, playing house so earnestly it put a lump in your throat. Because Blake Spear wasn't worth this. Maybe nobody was. Fish tried to understand Jamie and how it was with her. Between her and Blake there was youth and proximity at home, and at work. Either she'd found him the room or the job. There would be pity, too, on Jamie's side, and maybe something of the reformist as in so many women, an urge to take the hard rough clod, moisten it with kindness, and then remold it. And if she had faith in him, if Blake lied well enough, she'd have provided his alibi to help him avoid persecution from the police. Jamie, Fish thought, was a very nice thing to happen to anyone. And then he was telling himself that he really knew nothing about her. She was two-dimensional, a doll he'd cut out of paper when in the mood for cutting out dolls. He'd fashioned her to a pattern, no party girl, not sophisticated, but somebody who would be nice to talk to at the end of a day when a skip had eluded him or a divorce plan had blown up in his face. Fish's attention shifted to the door at the side of the drugstore building where Blake Spear appeared wearing a gray-green slack suit. His face was scrubbed pink, his pink blonde hair wetted down. The boy look was there. And the brute look too. After a furtive glance in either direction, he stepped to the curb, waited for a break in traffic, and then jaywalked directly toward Fish's car. Now what the hell, Fish wondered. "Hi-ya, Fish, ol' pal." Blake dropped a heavy hand on Fish's arm. "Jamie's having me over for dinner. So rub it in," Fish thought. He didn't say anything. "I got to thinking, as long as you're hanging around, why'n't you up and eat with me and Jamie?" "No, thanks," Fish said stiffly. He withdrew his arm from the sill. "I'm a busy man, Blake. I've got to find somebody to take 30 grand reward off my hands for the return of the Adams jewels." "Sorry I can't help you there, Fish," Blake said. But his grin was sly and it made you wonder. It was, Fish thought, intended to make you wonder. He watched Blake return to the other side of the street and enter the building where Jamie lived. Then Fish switched on the ignition and kicked angrily at the starter. To tell with a caper where the suspicious characters dressed up in pretty halos while the so-called nice people behaved like thieves at a picnic. When he traded early dark for the small hushed lobby of his apartment hotel, Fish was beckoned to the desk by Benny, the night clerk. There was a telegram, and as Benny handed over the buff envelope, he added, "And a Mr. Ashley to see you. He's in the tap room with a lady." "Ashley," Fish repeated absently. He knew no Ashley. Fish ripped the envelope. The enclosed wire from Colonel Blake in Chicago was not coded. "Charles Jules recovered here. Drop investigation," which was a fine thing, actually, Fish thought. If he could drop it. If murder was something you could just walk away from, this was a fine thing. He drummed lightly on the desk. "This Ashley now, he wouldn't be wearing a white gardenia so I'd know him, perchance?" Benny laughed. "He is wearing a platinum blonde and a picture hat, and you've heard that old one about boys seldom make passes at girls who wear glasses? She'll give you a new slant on that." M. Organ nodded his thanks, sauntered to the door, and entered the small, quiet tap room where dim lighting provided a sense of seclusion. He had no trouble at all spotting Cindy Sharp at one of the small tables. The ex-Mrs. Adams was wearing a big black hat and a frock with a black chiffon bodice. The man she was with had straight, light brown hair that grew in a cute drake's tail at the nape of his neck. He was wearing a light gray tropic worsted suit. Fish approached the table, and Ashley looked up out of eyes the color of strong tea. He had a thin, straight nose, full lips, and one of those chins that don't go anywhere. He stood when Fish addressed him, put out a hand that proved remarkably strong. He then introduced Cindy Sharp, who smiled and said how do you do as though they had never met. "I'd like a word with you in private, Mr. Fish," Ashley said hastily as Fish reached for an unoccupied chair. "That is, if Miss Sharp will excuse us." Fish smiled down at the glowing oval of face, into the clear eyes that regarded him calmly. "What made you think Red Bailey was murdered?" He pushed that at her quietly just to see what she would do with it. "And she didn't do anything." Her face remained perfectly composed. "That was a slip of the tongue, Mr. Fish." "I see," he said, and thought it must be gratifying to slip in the right direction. He wished he'd made such a slip earlier in the game. He turned to find that Ashley had led off a good 10 feet from the table and now waited impatiently, his frown disapproving. It was with the same frown that he glanced about Fish's living room some seconds later. Maybe he didn't go for old red mahogany and the serviceable Italian tapestries in which the furniture was upholstered. At Fish's invitation he sat down as though he had eggs in his pockets. He seemed unconscious of the chin deficiency and kept a hand over the lower part of his face while he talked. "I've entered into something of a Galahad venture," he announced, shaking his head at the cigarettes Fish proffered. "Black Mask Detective Magazine." "All right. Sir." Galahad was so obviously on the tip of Fish's tongue that Ashley gave him a penetrating look out of yellowish eyes and then returned to picking at a loose thread in the tapestry that covered the arm of the chair. "I believe in the direct approach," he said as Fish dumped his lean body into a chair on the opposite side of the small room. "The lady you met downstairs is being victimized by blackmailers. She has in the past committed certain, indiscretions, so to speak. There are letters and photographs which she is most anxious to regain. Inasmuch as she is soon to make what I believe is called a fortunate marriage into one of the fine old families, these blackguards have a real club over her. Do I make myself clear?" "Yeah, you do," Fish said unpleasantly. "Since one hear the same story on an average of once a week, I'd probably understand if you spoke only Japanese. You want me to establish contact with these people, pay them their blood money, and get back the evidence." The thread Ashley had been working on broke with a distinct pop, and he rolled it into a tiny ball with a nervous thumb and forefinger. "The contact has been established. I have the money with me." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and drew out 3 inches of manila envelope. "I am to meet these blackmailers in," Ashley glanced at his watch. "1 hour from now at an established point along the Collings Road. Frankly, the whole thing makes me a bit nervous. I am willing to pay you a fee to accompany me, though I have specific instructions to come alone." He spread his lips in a hopeful smile. "Though you might crouch down on the floor of the rear compartment. Do you carry a gun, by the way?" Fish shook his head. "I can if I have to." "No, I'm sure it won't be necessary," Ashley said slowly. "They'd hardly attempt to kill the goose that lays the golden egg." Fish offered no assurance. He took a long drag on his cigarette and looked at the ceiling. He wanted a drink. He wanted the good clean taste of bourbon in his mouth. But he was not sharing good whiskey with the likes of Mr. Ashley. "What is your fee for this sort of thing?" Ashley asked. "You mean, what is my fee, period?" The job doesn't determine the rate. $35 a day or any part of a day. An hour is a part of a day, and if that's too steep for you, that'll be fine because I'd a whole lot rather go to bed. Ashley waved $35 aside as a mere nothing and took out his wallet. The bills he extended fluttered like aspen leaves in his nervous hand. I'll go right down and see Miss Sharp into a cab, he said as he went to the door. If you will meet me in front of the hotel in 5 minutes, we'll get this over. That is, little pinpricks of sweat broke out on Ashley's rather flat forehead. His laugh quavered. Well, in 5 minutes, then? Fish nodded. As he closed the door, the phone started to ring. He crossed to the writing desk, picked up the handset. Blake Speer's voice, plainly agitated, came from the receiver. Where in the hell are you, Fish? I mean, what happened to you? I'm in the hospital and I got run over by a truck, Fish said nastily. Now wait, Fish. Easy does it. I just got the idea maybe I can help you get rid of that 30 thou after all. You mean you know where the Adams jewels are? Fish, that's just what I mean, Blake chuckled. Took the words right out of my mouth. Well, so do I, Fish said. And you haven't got them. He slammed the phone onto its standard, turned, went toward the bedroom. He got out of his suit coat and went to the closet. He took down his gun and its harness. Chapter 5. When they had crossed the old covered bridge and turned left on Call Ling's road, Ashley had told Fish he'd better get down on the floor back there. So now he sat out of casual sight on the rough carpet, his back to the door, his lean arms lashed about Fleck's knees, and gave himself up to the erratic movement of Ashley's sedan, which would slow almost to a stop and spurt forward again. What in the hell are you trying to do? Fish complained. Ashley laughed uneasily. I'm looking for a mailbox with the name Happy Hollow printed on it. He kept looking, and after 3 more slowdowns and spurts, he braked to a stop and turned off his lights. The darkness was absolute. Ashley got out. Fish counted 2 steps on gravel before Ashley's feet found the soft grassy shoulder. Fish was to wait 5 minutes. If Ashley didn't return to the car by that time, Fish was supposed to find a path that led down to a cabin on the creek bank. He was supposed to do this in very high-grade darkness and in spite of an aversion to snakes that amounted almost to terror. It was a screwy setup. It went well with the Adams caper, so well that the two might have been connected by an umbilical cord. He sat there on the floor of the car with his knees under his chin and listened to the distant gurgle of the creek, the chirp of katydids, and the serenade of an errant mosquito. He waited. He thought 5 minutes had passed. He waited a little longer to make sure. Then he slid his hand down inside his coat and brought out the gun. He got over onto his knees, fumbled the door latch, turned it, and what in this gadget-ridden old world should appear but Fish himself fully illuminated by the dome light that came on automatically when the door opened. As he got from the car he must have made a fine target for somebody waiting hard by the right rear fender, because the blow to the head was clean and quick, and he had no sensation at all of meeting the ground. No lump. 2, Fish thought. I always take 2 in my coffee. Stewed, huh? The hell? Come on, Fish, quit stalling. He was being shaken, not gently. Then slapped. He opened his eyes in the glare of an electric torch. His eyes closed again on the distinct impression that he was in a forest of trouser legs. He tried to think, to put trousered legs and the sensation of rapid rotation with the odors of dust, new cut hay, and strong whiskey. He tried to tie all that into a package and decide where he was. On a merry-go-round in a hayfield and there was standing room only, and who had the bourbon? It was not at all reasonable. Who has the bourbon? He asked plaintively. He opened his eyes and sat up. The dust was beneath him, it pushed up through splayed fingers of the hands that helped support him. You, fella. You had it, quite a lot. Fish looked into the round robust face of one Leon Proust of the sheriff's office, whose toothy smile always recalled the front end of a Buick. And conversely, Fish said. The front end of a Buick always reminds me of Leon Proust. What hit me, Leon? The county cop pulled his lips over his teeth as best he could and tried to look grim. He was moderately successful. I'm not sure you were hit. The load you're carrying, maybe you passed out. I was hit, Fish insisted. With a head like mine you can't argue. With no lump you can argue. Maybe you came out of the bulrushes into the path of that first car and pulled a phony Joe. Maybe you thought the driver would be able to identify you. Or something. Fish realized he did have the bourbon. But outside, all over his suit coat. He reeked like a weekend about to be lost. He had a head, though, like Monday morning, And if there was no lump, he supposed you could argue. Now arms that were conceivably connected with the trousered legs hauled him to his feet. About him the dark was shot through with vagrant lights. There were cars stretching back along the side of the road. There were strange, hostile faces gaping at him. Leon Proust patted Fish and came up with a gun. Proust sniffed at the muzzle. His grunt was all satisfaction. Fish said, "Aha," wisely. In front of him, along the shoulder, there was a concentration of small lights. There the dust-covered ragweed had been swirled and trampled. Their white coats gleamed, the backs in them bowed over somebody. "Ashley?" Fish wondered. Leon Proust said. "Ashley, he calls him. A good friend of yours, huh? First names yet." "Mr. Ashley, then." Proust grunted. Slow recovery after a fumble. "Dead?" "Sure, dead. Let him stand, Martin." And Fish stood alone, swaying. "How many, Leon?" 24. 1. "How many more does it take in the head?" Proust was unfriendly, sore about something. About Ashley, probably. Dead, Ashley became quite a bother. Proust said. "You tell us, handsome. What were you and Quinlan doing out here?" "Quinlan?" Fish repeated dazedly. But it had started to hitch. "Blake Spear, Quinlan Motors." "Ashley Quinlan. Who else did you bump tonight?" All along the line, it had started to hitch like freight cars shunted onto a siding. Fish licked dust off his dry lips. "Sure, Leon, I'll tell you." Proust nodded. "Downtown you can tell me." So downtown it was, in the county Bastille across from the police building, in a room with buff walls and a high ceiling. With Proust and a bright young man from the prosecutor's office, with a male stenographer who stood by and gouged up dandruff with the blunt end of his pencil. The only friendly face in the room was on the clock, and it said XO08. Fish tipped back in a chair and sent both hands after cigarettes. "Later." Proust shook his head. "First you talk." So he told them, beginning with Ashley Quinlan, who had palmed himself off as Mr. Ashley. Then he spoke of Cindy Sharp, who wanted some letters back from a blackmailer. He told it as straight as he had it, and he knew what it sounded like. "Crap," Proust described it, showing his teeth. He seemed surprised when Fish nodded agreement. "But it'll check. With Benny, the night clerk. With Cindy Sharp." Proust reached lazily for the phone book. "This Cindy Sharp. I don't know her number," Fish said. "But she's North Side." Proust scowled into pages of Sharps and came up with. "Cindy A. On North Delaware?" Fish said it could be. He stood and stretched. His head was still thumping. The world's largest head, thumping all over. He worked his lips into a smile for Mr. Proust. "You furnish transportation to my humble abode?" Fish asked. Proust grunted. "Where you bed down tonight, you can walk." He moved to the door, opened it, and bawled out to somebody. "Hey, Ollie, show Fish the bridal suite." So he went to the bridal suite, not without protest, and the bride on the top shelf had grizzled beard stubble, a snore like a file on tool steel, and stank of old stump water. Fish, like many a man before him, shook the bars of the cage and shouted after the turnkey. "Get me Mark Talbot, damn it. Sergeant Talbot." Which neither impressed nor deterred this man Ollie. When his shadow had vanished along the corridor, Fish went to the lower bunk and sat on the edge of it. He listened to the night sounds of the jail, the snores, the nightmare mumblings, the restless shuffle of feet pacing the short distances. He sat without moving for what seemed at least half the night before the turnkey and Leon Proust reappeared at the cell door. "No, don't get up," Proust said thoughtfully. He showed his teeth in a Buick smile. "I got news for you, Jen." Owie unlocked the cell and Proust came in. "This good-looker named Sharp says you're a liar," Proust began pleasantly. "There are no letters, no photographs, and she isn't being blackmailed. As to her getting married to a man of means, she tried that once and was cured. She's earning her keep with her own itty-bitty hands designing goofy women's hats, or goofy hats for women, whichever you prefer. Though she's known Ashley Quinlan for a long time, a friend of her ex-husband, last night was her first date with him, and never again." "Well, that's reasonable," Fish said calmly. "Unless she goes to his funeral." He took a cigarette from the pack Proust offered, then a light. "What about Benny?" "The night clerk?" Proust nodded. "That checks. A Mr. Ashley, Benny says, not Quinlan. Also, something you didn't think of." "What didn't I think of?" The manila envelope in Ashley Quinlan's inside coat pocket. Proust dusted ash into the lavatory behind him. Contained some pieces of newspaper. Fish nodded, his mouth down at the corners. So I was had again. Now either book me or let me out of this roach trap. Proust was offended. This is the 26th cleanest county jail in the state of Indiana. And we'll book you for drunk and disorderly, if we have to. Or you can tell us the truth, Fish said. I'll talk to Talbot. I'll talk to no damned county cop with a face like the front end of a Buick. Proust smiled his smile and went back to the grilled door. Then we'll book you, John, nighty-night. Morning was 8ish, a grey morning with Proust back and with him Mark Talbot. Old Mark, the good grey monk of safe and loft, his face sober, with a chuckle unborn and kicking back of his belly. Oh, but it's funny, Fish said acidly. He stood without caution and bumped his fine large head on the bunk above and cursed horribly. Old Stumpwater snored on peacefully, and Fish wondered if the sod had taken the top berth to avoid snakes. Talbot said, I heard yo had found lodgings over here for the night. Fish stepped into his Oxfords and went out into the corridor WHH's laces flopping. Sober, are you? Proust asked considerately. Nuts? Asked Talbot. Talbot nodded. You were bopped, all right. They found what you were bopped with. Tell Proust, Fish said. I know I was bopped. With a woman's stocking, Talbot said. Oh? Proust opened the door of the tall room with the buff walls. He waved them into it. What was in the stocking? Not the usual thing. A block of yellow laundry soap, Talbot explained. They found it in the stocking in the weeds along Col Ling's road. Hence, no lump. But 2 dents in the soap. Twice he was bopped, Fish said. The hell. Once was enough. He folded down onto a chair, stooped to tie his shoelaces. 2 dents anyway, Talbot said. 1 for me, Fish thought, and 1 for Arnie. Arnie, too, had been bopped lumpless. He said. Get bloodhounds and cherchez la femme. He straightened, his face flushed, his head spinning. Talbot said. No femme ever wore these. Nothing but laundry soap. These? Proust asked. You found the mate to the stocking? New and unused, Talbot replied, nodding his grey head. In Ashley Quinlan's bachelor apartment. Now, he turned to Fish. Why would Quinlan want you dead? It was very keen of old Mark, Fish thought. He said. Because I knew Quinlan had the Adams jewels. It was not even a guess. It was something to cast in Proust's direction, and if Proust sank his teeth in it he'd be occupied for a while. Talbot asked. Brown hair, yellowish eyes, no chin? Ashley Quinlan to a T. Talbot looked pleased. We got that description from Chicago where they found the Adams jewels in a pawn shop. Wait. That was Proust proving difficult. He frowned at Fish. Ashley wanted you killed? He queried. Uh-huh. He bopped me, soaked me in whiskey. And if I was found on the bank of the creek with my face in the water, who was to say I hadn't gone on a tear and fallen into the drink? Hence the lumpless bop, do you see? What was this song and dance about Cindy Sharp and some letters? Fish said. You named it, Song and Dance. Quinlan brought in the woman as window dressing to make the blackmail story sound convincing. I thought at the time I was walking into something, but I zigged when I should have zagged. Proust wondered. What would a successful dealer in cars want with the Adams jewels? And who killed Quinlan if you didn't? Fish shrugged. That's not my worry, lucky me. He stood and glanced from Proust to the door. Proust hesitated only a moment. You sign a receipt for your pocket trinkets, John, and you can go. He added an unpleasant note. For now, Fish sighed, picked up his stuff, and left the jail with Mark Talbot. They stood for a moment on the sidewalk on the west side of Alabama Street, and Fish said, Thanks. I told you Blake Spear didn't swipe the Adams jewels, didn't I? Talbot reminded Fish. Did I say that he did? Fish's eyes were very black, very shiny. Now you've got Red Bailey and Ashley Quinlan, both of them dead. And you still haven't got anybody who can open 2 safe by the punch method. He nodded so long to Mark Talbot and sauntered off up the street. Fish picked up a cab on East Washington Street, told the driver to go out North Meridian to Quinlan Motors. He lighted a cigarette, settled back, and thought that now, finally, he was going to talk to Jamie. He wondered if she was at all like the girl he had imagined she was. Probably not. Probably no girl was. You get to dreaming, alone in the dark, Just you and a cigarette and the thin dregs in your glass. For that reason he rather dreaded a meeting with Jamie. That was one of the reasons. The cab braked suddenly, boosting Fish forward from the cushions. He looked out at Quinlan's polished glass front. He paid off the hack, got out, and then he saw Jamie again. Just a glimpse of her as she ran toward the bus stop lugging a suitcase and holding a blue hat on the back of her head. He shouted at her, started to run. But the bus was there, and he noticed in that instant before the pneumatic doors swallowed her, the hurt look about her sweet mouth, as though she were choking back tears. He stopped running, watched the bus roll out into traffic. Then he turned back and entered Quinlan's salesroom. 3 personality boys were huddled in front of a nifty sports job, maybe talking about the sudden demise of the boss. Fish approached the group briskly with the name of Blake Spindell on his lips. Not here. Didn't come in this morning. Anything I can do for you, sir? The personality boys in a chorus, but Fish had already turned back to the door. Now out on the sidewalk, he dropped his cigarette into the gutter, took his life in his hands as he jaywalked Meridian to get to the U-Drive It garage. There he picked up a rental, drove north to 34th Street and across to park in front of the tavern where he had parked on the night before. He crossed to the drugstore building, went up the steps 2 at a time into a dingy hall where he peered at cards on doors until he found Blake Spears. He knocked. The door was immediately opened by Mark Talbot looking haggard and gray. A meeting of great minds, Fish began, but his eyes followed the wave of Talbot's puffy hand. There was Blake Spindell. On the rug. Wearing pajama bottoms. Also wearing the horn handle of a knife right of the sternum and between, say, the 5th and 6th ribs. He had been dead some time. Fish stepped over the threshold, got his eyes off Blake's spear, spotted the phone. Fish elbowed Talbot and pointed. Jamie. What? Miss Williams. Hop to it, Mark. I saw her with a suitcase heading downtown on a bus. Going bye-bye in a hurry. Tail tramped heavily to the phone. While he was dialing, Fish took a deep breath that brought the lingering fragrance of flowers to his nostrils. Perfume. Something light, not too cloying. He was no good on perfume. Radio dispatcher, Talbot said into the phone, looking sadly at Fish. In the brief interval of waiting, the old man said. You stay out of murder, John. Do you hear? Oh, sure, Fish said. But it was hard to stay out after you'd once been dragged in, first as a corpse that didn't quite make the grade, and then as a fall guy. Police picked up Jamie within 5 minutes after Talbot's call. They caught her at the Union Bus Terminal as she was buying a ticket for Rising Sun, Indiana, where her parents lived. Fish got her story third-handedly from Talbot who, in turn, had talked with somebody on homicide. Jamie and Blake had quarreled the previous evening. It seemed there was a roll of bills, a much larger roll than Blake ought to have had. Jamie had asked questions. The alibi she had provided him, on the Adams caper, was a lie. But she had lied gladly, believing in him until she caught sight of this roll he was carrying. She had then accused him of deceiving her, of having a hand in the Adams job. That had led to the quarrel. This morning she had decided to quit her job and go home to Rising Sun, Indiana. But there were other things. There was Jamie's perfume lingering around Blake's room. Her favorite scent. There was the knife from her kitchen, and while she explained he had borrowed it to cut a cake she had made for him, that, homicide thought, sounded rather pat. It did not look well for Jamie. Talbot, heavy-hearted, thought that it didn't look well at all. Fish left police headquarters and walked toward Washington Street. He tried not to think about Jamie threading her lonely way across no man's land mined with all the booby traps the homicide boys could devise. He stepped into the first drugstore he came to, went back to the phone booth, and called the Adams residence. After the usual to-do with the butler, Fish got Charlotte Adams on the wire. Still scared, honey? He asked her. Honey, I am. I need a good detective bad, honey. She had been at the gin already this morning. You could almost smell slow berries through the telephone. This evening? He suggested. Uh-huh. Charlotte, very agreeable. But not here, Fish. Anywhere you say, but not here. How about my place? He wondered. The Marion. Suite 412, say 8ish. 8ish, he said. You'd better repeat that address. I'd hate to have you wandering around looking. Especially looking the way that you look. Her purring laugh. Sweet boy. The Marion. Suite 412. Roger. He hung up. He was certain now that Charlotte didn't know that the Adams house was wired for sound. After that he haunted the second-hand record shops until he found a disc of Paper Doll. Then he took a taxi out to Gordo Nash's bungalow because he needed to borrow a gun. His own black masked active magazine was still at the sheriff's office for obvious reasons. He found Gordo in the backyard raking crabgrass out of his lawn. He was a tall gaunt man in his 60s with a deeply lined face and disillusioned blue eyes. He leaned on his rake and explained that he'd been downtown that morning trying to persuade Dr. Adams' office nurse to let him have a peek at Blake Spindoo's medical record. "No soap, huh?" Fish said. "Not a chip. Then I tried the general practitioner who sent Blake to Dr. Adams, and no soap there either. They got ethics, these medics. Just like you and me," and Gordo winked. "You've established Blake as a regular patient, though. That's something. And I know one thing that was wrong with him physically." "What's that?" Gordo Nash wondered. "Dextrocardia." It meant nothing to Gordo. "Do you die of it?" "Not generally. But Blake managed to." Fish looked toward the back door of the little white house where Mrs. Gordo Nash was calling them both into lunch. And it suddenly occurred to Fish just how hungry he was. It was 3 o'clock before Fish got back to his apartment hotel with the borrowed gun in his underarm sling. He picked up his mail at the desk, and among other things was a 6x8 envelope labeled "Photographs, do not fold." In his rooms, he put the second-hand disc of Paper Doll down on radio phonograph console, dumped his mail on the writing desk, took off his coat and the gun harness. Then he called Talbot to find out if there was anything new on Jamie. There wasn't. They still had her. Fish hung up, sat down at the desk, and opened the 6x8 envelope. It contained a cardboard stiffener, a glossy print copyright F-Girl to which had been clipped a piece of note paper. On the paper was written in pencil, "Believe me, this Patty Bryce is not dead." McGowan. Fish smiled slightly. Great sense of humor, this McGowan. He then raised the note paper for a glimpse of this blonde. There was much to be seen of her, for she was clad in her tissue paper costume, including the paper panties. She had a cute dimple in her chin and great, dark shadowed eyes. The autograph read, "Very sincerely yours, Patty Bryce." Which was sweet of her, Fish thought. Especially since he'd never seen this babe anywhere before in his life. Chapter 6. She knocked at his door at 7:50 p.m. He opened the door, stepped back, rubbed the back of his neck, and said, Well, way. Fooled me again." "Again?" "Well, never mind. It was the wrong Mrs. Adams. The ex, known now as Cindy Sharp. She was wearing lime green. Very cool. Cold even, when worn with that expression of so slight annoyance. She came in, and he bowed her to a chair which she sat on as though she would not stay very long. "A drink?" he suggested, starting toward the liquor cabinet which he had freshly stocked with sloe gin for Charlotte. "No, thank you." She looked up at him through harlequin glasses and out of aquamarine eyes, and she asked, "Whatever possessed you to tell the police Mr. Quinlan had hired you to recover letters of mine from a blackmailer?" "That's what Quinlan hired me for," he said simply. He was lying, of course. "Have a cigarette?" "Thank you, no." She was furious. Beautifully furious. And she wanted nothing of him except maybe his head on a platter. "Let's not bicker among ourselves, Miss Sharp," he said. "Let's bicker with Ashley Quinlan since he can't defend himself. What reason did he give you for wanting to see me?" "Business. I presumed it was a car deal. While the man meant absolutely nothing to me, I was rather put out that he would interrupt our evening together for a stupid business transaction." Fish sat down opposite her. She had wonderful legs. He smiled at her. "Let's put it this way. I'll believe you if you believe me. And if I ever take you to dinner, I'll drink to the only with mine eyes." She accepted that as her due with a very small smile. "Why would Ashley Quinlan lie to us both?" "He needed you as window dressing to make his story of blackmail ring true. He needed an excuse to get me out on a lonely road so he could kill." "Kill you?" "Uh-huh. Because I know too much about the Paper Doll." He watched curiosity erase every affectation of boredom on her beautiful face. So he told her about Patty Bryce and her strip act and saw Cindy Sharp take on a strangely ecstatic smile. "Love light of the late Mr. Bailey," she said musingly. "That's rather precious." Her laugh had a Borgia lilt in it. "Now," he said. He extended long legs comfortably and tipped cigarette ash into a crystal tray on the red mahogany table beside him. "Now, once more, why did you go to Red Bailey's?" She crossed her knees with a seductive hiss of nylon and looked away from him. I had met Charlotte Adams only once, but I have always wondered about her background, or utter lack of it. When this thing occurred, I began casting about wildly for something that might substantiate my woman's intuition. Her pale eyes returned to Fish. If Charlotte should turn out to be this Patty Bryce, this, entertainer who had so fascinated Mr. Bailey, it would be a source of endless amusement to me. The dear Dr. Adams so prides himself on his discernment. Maybe he was feeling charitable, but Fish was inclined to accept that. He asked, "Whom did you phone from Bailey's room?" "Oh, that. That was a mere nothing," Black Masked Detective Magazier and Cindy Sharp cast it aside in a fluttering gesture. "There was a phone number scratched on the tabletop, and I called it experimentally. Some woman answered with, 'Quinlan Motors. Miss Williams speaking. Jamie again, always around.' But that got you nowhere. Bailey had been bothering Blake Spear, who had worked for Quinlan." "Were there microphones hidden about the Adams house when you lived there?" Fish asked. She nodded, watching her fingers toy with the clasp of her purse. He thought her eyes were turned in upon herself in unpleasant retrospection. "Adams is a damnable person to live with. It's like being in jail. And that impossible Arnie. The tattletale." "Exactly." She looked up, brightening. "How did you find out about the microphones?" Fish asked, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Don't answer that if you'd rather not. If I told you I found one while looking under the living room sofa to see how well the maid had dusted," she was watching his face curiously for traces of incredulity. Not finding anything of the sort nor yet any clear-cut indication of belief, she laughed without embarrassment. "I think I'd rather let you guess, Mr. Fish." "That'll be fun." His dark eyes on her, intently guessing, brought a faint flush to her cheeks. And then there was a quiet tap on his door. "Charlotte," he thought, and stood quickly, his finger on his lips. He crossed to Cindy. "Charlotte," he whispered. "Go into the bedroom, if you're still curious." Cindy stood as he moved toward the foyer. She tiptoed to the bedroom. He gave her time to get out of sight before he opened the corridor door. Charlotte was there in a trim little suit of spice brown and no hat. She pouted up at him. "Took you a while, Fish," she said, and then tipped toward him. The pout was still there, and he kissed it hello and held both of her elbows in his hands. She pushed against his chest with her purse and looked into his face with those nothing surprises me eyes. "My nice private policeman," she said softly. "Now I feel safe." "An insult, if I ever heard one," he said. They both laughed, and she went gaily to the sofa to sit down on the cushion beneath which Fish had hidden Gordo Nash's gun. That was ungood but could probably be remedied. "A drink?" he suggested. "But yes." She was stripping off gloves. "Whatever you're having, Fish. I feel awfully congenial tonight." He slipped ice cubes into old-fashioned glasses, fished in the cabinet for the bourbon, put down the bottle, and went to the record player. "Soft lights and sweet music," he explained as he pressed a button. "And a drink, Fish," she reminded him. "I'm too old to suck ice cubes," he laughed, went back to the liquor cabinet, and eased bourbon into the glasses as the phonograph began to play a piano recording of Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered. He took the glasses to the sofa, handed one to Charlotte. Johnry, that looks good." "Is what the doctor ordered." He stood in front of her and slightly to her right. "Move over, will you, kitten? I've an old saber wound on my right side." She moved quickly, without fuss. "Anything you say, Fish. What's that word again?" "Congenial." He sat down over the gun. He might readily reach it with his right hand in case they had visitors. And he thought they might have. His latch string was literally out. Charlotte fitted herself cozily into the crook of his left arm and they sipped their bourbon. "What's Charlie doing tonight?" he asked without too much interest. "The hospital." She rolled her eyes. "So he says." She lowered the level of her glass to the halfway mark. "Fish, what do you think? The deadly double has a girl." "No." That he could not believe. She nodded her moppet's head vigorously. "But yes. He came home last night simply reeking of perfume. Do you believe in sauce for the goose?" "Aha." With half an ear on a deft passage from Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered. "Good," she said. "You're congenial too, Fish. That damn Arnie. Last night he let the air out of my tires and did something to the phone." She tipped forward to put her glass on the coffee table and, leaning back again, she turned smoothly to come into his arms, facing him, her green eyes half closed. "Kiss me, Fish," she whispered. He was doing that when Paper Doll came up on the record player. She broke away, clear away to the other end of the sofa in a neat quick bound and sat rigidly, panting, her eyes on him, narrow and bright. You, dirty heel, she breathed. You've known all along, Haven''T.U? Well, Fish was not altogether pleased with himself. There were indications. Such as? You mugged for the news photographer. A pretty woman wouldn't unless maybe she didn't want to be recognized. And? You called Bailey an Irishman. Bailey is a Welsh name, but his mother was Irish. So you'd known him before. A photograph of Patty Bryce that I got through the mail today was slightly confusing until I remembered that small-time entertainers sometimes sell their stage names along with their acts. And, well, something had to be done. He drank what was left of his drink, needing it. Because this is murder. She threw back her head and laughed at him. You think you can prove that? He put his glass down beside hers. I can draw a pretty good blueprint. I don't know how you foxed Dr. Adams into marrying you, but it's a cinch you met in Chicago and he didn't have the slightest notion you were an ex-stripper. I met him at a convention, she said. He was being very conventional and so was I. What's that got to do with it? Let's start with Blake Spear, Bailey's pal, Fish said, drawing the blueprint. Blake was on parole. A girl named Jamie Williams was trying to make something out of him. He needed medical attention, so Jamie sent him to a general practitioner who, in turn, sent him to Dr. Adams. During one of Blake's calls at Dr. Adams' office, you came in to pick up some spending money, or something. Blake saw you and recognized you as the babe who used to strip at the Coconut Club, she said. Blake stood up at our wedding. You were married to Bailey? He hadn't known that. He watched her kick at the leg of the coffee table with the toe of a brown pump. Her face was sullen, and she didn't reply. Anyway, he went on. After the usual sounding out process, Blake started to blackmail you. But Dr. Adams is the money bags, making it tough. So you went to Ashley Quinlan for help. Ashley put up the black money in exchange for, shall we say, a sweet glance and a kind word? You're doing the talking, she said. When Blake became more and more demanding, you and Ashley worked out a plan to get rid of Blake. Blake, not Bailey, who hadn't come into the picture at that time. You were going to kill Blake Spear and get by with it. You must have told Blake that in order to meet his demands you'd have to sell your jewels, and to do that without exciting Dr. Adams' suspicions you'd have to set the stage as a robbery. Blake's part was to break open the safe, Ashley Quinlan's to dispose of the jewels. No risk for Blake at all, so you must have explained. No risk, except that you were going to kill him. Fish broke off as Charlotte picked up her glass, stood, and swayed to the liquor cabinet for a reload. Go on, she said, her back to him. You're very clever, I'm sure. You picked night before last, he said. Because Dr. Adams would be in Chicago and you could arrange for all the servants to be out except Arnie, the watchdog. Ashley Quinlan took care of Arnie with a lump of soap in a stocking, then tied Arnie with a tow line. As soon as Blake had the safe open, you were going to shoot him, then call the police. But there was a slip-up. She came back to the sofa and seemed to be having a little trouble keeping the bourbon in the glass. That damned Red Mick, she said. Fish nodded. Bailey had been bothering Blake. He trailed Blake that night, right into the Adams house. He got there before the safe was open, maybe while Blake was getting the necessary tools out of the garage. Faced with Bailey, you got excited and emptied the gun in him. A hell of a mess, she said thickly. She took a quick swallow of bourbon and looked at Fish with tears in her eyes. All my eggs in one basket. Uh-huh. None left for Blake. Now you had Blake like a millstone about your neck. Up to that time he'd been getting what he could from Ashley Quinlan, through you, including the job you got Ashley to give Blake at the garage. But this was murder and Blake knew it. Let it get out that you'd married Bailey, and it was murder in any language. Still, to save you for his own purposes, Blake went through with cracking the safe, and Ashley, for the same reason, flew the jewels to Chicago. Things began to get complicated for you. Things did, she admitted. Blake thought this was his chance at the big money, a chunk out of Dr. Adams' fat bank account which the deadly double would be willing to pay to keep his wife out of criminal court on a murder charge. But Blake was scared, too. He knew you and Ashley Quinlan were capable of murder. He wanted protection until he could collect from Dr. Adams. So, while fixing an alibi for himself with the police, he also acted suspicious enough around me so that I'd put an operative on him. Furnish a bodyguard for free until he got that piece of big dough from the doctor. The record player had worked its way down to some enchanted evening. It was enchanted, all right. Even haunted. He stared at Charlotte Adams' sullen profile. He thought of Cindy Sharp in the bedroom, taking this all in with that ecstatic smile on her beautiful face. There was, he recalled, an old Cuban street song that Dr. Adams had probably never heard. If you want to lead a happy life, take an ugly woman for your wife. But I spoiled everything, he said. You did. She didn't look at him. For everybody. Accidentally. When you jerked those tissue panties out of my pocket, you thought I was on the trail of the paper doll. And I wasn't. He gave him a quick searching look and then dipped her mouth to the bourbon. You decided that you and Ashley Quinlan would have to get rid of me before you had another mouth to feed. Yesterday, after you thought Dr. Adams had gone to the hospital, you called Quinlan. He came to the house, and the two of you laid plans to get me out onto Collings Road to kill me. Quinlan was to get me out there, bop me lumpless, douse me with whiskey. Then you were supposed to come along, and the two of you would drag me to the creek bank, stick my head in the water, and let nature take its course. I wish to God we'd managed it, she said calmly, sipping his bourbon. What you don't know, apparently, he went on, is that Dr. Adams didn't go to the hospital. He sent Arnie barreling out of the drive in the business coupe, just to trick you. Dr. Adams remained in the chauffeur's quarters, a jealous husband spying on his so attractive wife. And eavesdropping, too. She stared at him. Fish said. You didn't know about the concealed microphones and the ever-listening ear. She shook her head. Sure, he said. That's why Arnie wouldn't let you go out last night to meet Ashley Quinlan on Collings Road. But, she moistened her lips. Somebody did. Somebody certainly did. Charlie, with your plans in his head and hell in his heart. The jealous husband. He met Ashley Quinlan and they quarreled over my gun and Charlie shot Ashley and left me for the fall guy. Charlotte scooted along the sofa toward him. Now I am scared. After Ashley, there was Blake. Blake was expecting Charlie to come along with the balance of the lump payment for silence on the killing of Red Bailey. And Charlie put a knife into Blake. Just once. Remember what I said about killing a snake? Just one jab with the knife, but in exactly the right place, to the right of the sternum, or breastbone. She frowned. But that's wrong. It's right if you've got dextrocardia, and only his doctor would know Blake had it. That meant the position of his heart was exactly the reverse of the position of most people's hearts. Fish broke it off there because his unlocked door had opened. There was a neat little shadow in the foyer and the dull flash of gun steel. Charlotte screamed and flung herself on Fish in a frantic, unreasoned move that had to do with her own protection. Fish dumped her on the floor, and she rolled. He reared back on the sofa, reached between his knees for Gordo Nash's gun. Dr. Adams' first shot was wild but not so wild but what Fish felt the breeze from it along his left cheek. Fish shot without aiming, and his bullet seemed to have gone up Dr. Adams' right coat sleeve. Very hot. Very penetrating. Also, very lucky. And the doctor stood like a little gray rock, his lipless mouth open, and tried to switch the gun to his left hand. But Fish was on him then with a chopping blow that cut the gun out of Charlie's hand. Then Fish gun whipped Charlie across the side of the head, and all of the taut drawn wires seemed to snap at once. Charlotte Adams was back on the sofa, her legs coiled up under her, pressing back as though she could shrivel herself into the upholstery and never be noticed. But she would always be noticed, with that face and that figure. And Cindy Sharp came out of the bedroom, smiling very coldly. Fish went to the phone. Presently, they were all riding downtown with some official escorts. As soon as Charlie could talk, he did. Mark Talbot had something to contribute on the subject of perfume. It seemed Talbot had checked with the drugstore on 34th Street. The clerk said that Blake had bought a peace offering for his girl. For Jamie. Her favorite scent and perfume. The package must have been there in Blake's room when Charlie had called to do murder, and he had sprinkled it about as a red herring. So Jamie was free. Fish didn't see her that night, nor until several weeks later. Then she was along Meridian Street's Automobile Row again, working somewhere. He caught a glimpse of her, and the hurt look was still around her sweet mouth. He intended to do something about her sometime. Maybe tomorrow. Or should you shatter a dream?